All right. There's one last housekeeping item before we go here. If you do have a question, feel free to type it in the chat section, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. If there's other information or questions or things that you have after, by all means, we'll be providing the contact information for you as well to reach out to the team here. So yeah, feel free to ask away during the presentation, and we'll get to those at the end. But we got a couple minutes after, so we'll go ahead and get started. Appreciate everyone taking some time out of your Wednesday to join us here for a discussion around cybersecurity, around cyber insurance. My name is Anthony Garofalo. I'm the Director of Business Development here with Xamin. Just a quick little agenda run through here for everyone. So we're just going to do the 30-second commercial. Many of you probably have not heard of Xamin. You probably haven't heard of Couch Braunsdorf. So just to give you an idea who's speaking today, I'm going to kind of give you the lay of the land as far as data breaches and what we're seeing from a cyber incident perspective across the globe and here in the U.S. and what that means in real dollars. Talk a little bit more about the cyber insurance landscape, what that means to you, and then compliance and regulation, and then how ultimately you guys can build a better security foundation and hopefully lower those cybersecurity premiums. And then we'll have our Q&A at the end there. So just real quick, for those of you that haven't heard of Xamin or don't know much about us, so we've been around since '99. We're a very boutique managed services and IT compliance advisory practice. So we have clients nationwide, but we specialize in clients that are very reputational sensitive or fall under heavy regulatory scrutiny. So we do try to focus in on those. We're SOC 2 certified, zero deviations. And again, we're very excited to present this to you today. Eric?
Hey, my name's Eric Wistrand. I'm CIO of Couch Braunsdorf. Couch has been around since 1903. Couch Braunsdorf is a privately owned independent agency headquartered in Liberty Corner, New Jersey. We have a nationwide presence with strong relationships with over 60 insurance carriers, and our goal is to maintain that local feel of a local independent agency while having the flexibility and capability of the large players. Frankly, we're having this conversation today from an insurance perspective because we worked for the past 2.5 years on developing a cyber liability and cybersecurity practice group. So we're delighted to be invited to this presentation.
Excellent. And last but not least, who's also on the call with us today, Jeremy Baumrock. He's the Director of Professional Services here at Xamin, going to be diving into the compliance side of things as we move forward with the presentation. So just to kind of level set for everyone, I know if looking at the industry, the cybersecurity landscape, it seems like every day on LinkedIn or on the news, we're hearing about a new breach. I mean, the cost of breaches have, been astronomical lately. If you look at the numbers on the slide there, and really interestingly enough, looking at a global scale, the U.S. has one of the highest numbers and highest cost of data breaches. So, this is going nowhere but up. So it's really about, how can we best mitigate our risk? How can we best put together a holistic package, a holistic program to address cybersecurity and ensure that we are safe for the future? There's no silver bullet, but it's all about mitigating that risk. And interestingly enough, again, the clients that we deal with are mainly in the highly regulated areas. Who are the bad guys targeting, right? So they are the highly regulated areas. So if you look at this, the average cost of a data breach by industry, healthcare, financial, pharmaceuticals, technology, energy, all in the top areas there. So, these are the clients with patient data, financial records, things that actually can make bad guys money. And malicious actors money. So, these are the ones that are very heavily targeted, and a lot of these headlines that you do see day to day. So if you are in a highly regulated industry, legal, finance, healthcare, professional services, this is very pertinent for you. and it is very important to have these measures and a plan in place to reduce risk and to ensure that you are safe, from cyber events. So, how are people being breached today? There's a bunch of different ways that, they're getting in. Phishing, we still see, tends to be the most costly for an organization. We do see, stolen credentials is the most common. So, people just reusing a password or using a password as 1234, not having a proper password policy in place. Those are the things where bad actors are getting in the easiest and the most. But phishing still tends to cost the most for an organization. Just want to highlight, and you guys may have seen some of these in the news, but again, going back to my previous comment, every day on LinkedIn or the news, we're seeing these headlines, right? So this was earlier in the year. So American Bar Association, they had 1.5 million members affected in this hack. So this was due to bad passwords, bad credentials that was compromised. So, people not following proper password, policies or procedures. Malicious actors were able to get in and then, steal all of that data for the 1.5 million members. So again, having these things in place, having the proper controls in place is paramount, not to end up like the American Bar Association. Another one that was interesting, we see this a lot too today, where clients now are looking more at their third-party partners. So I would urge everyone on the call, take a look or make a list of the third-party partners that you do work with that you would consider critical. This one came with IntelliHardix through a third-party Forta. So there was a hack within Forta, and then through the two systems working together, they were able to get the information for around 500,000 patients within IntelliHardix. So it's not just your own environment, but it's the partners you work with, ensuring that they have the proper procedures and security measures, so they're not affecting your business as well. So just again, some interesting what things I wanted to highlight here that we're seeing. We still go back to the human side of breaches, right? So, the old saying is, the humans are the weakest link, right? Going back to the phishing campaigns, this is where security awareness training really comes into play. I would also urge you, if you have not evaluated security awareness training in your organization, or it's not something on the roadmap, I'd highly recommend, taking a look at that and what that would mean to the organization. It's just one click of a bad link or a bad email, or, entering in some sort of sensitive data is going to open you up to all sorts of potential issues here. So having a proper plan around training the employees around, what's safe, what's not safe, and what to do if there is something that they do think is malicious. Social engineering, we still see that in the landscape as well. Just as phishing, that's very, very popular. 50%, the data that we got here from Gartner, 50% and Verizon, the incidents involve social engineering. So again, something to keep in mind as you are doing that security awareness training and building that program. This is interesting here, the cost in days and then the average days to identify. So a lot of times, there could be someone, unfortunately, on the call today that's been breached, right? It takes about 277 days on average for an organization to understand that they've been breached. So think about that for a minute, what that could potentially mean, what data that malicious actor is gathering within that time frame, right? And that's why so much around, SIM, managed endpoint detection and response, vulnerability scanning, all these things are extremely important to help reduce the time of days of detection. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about that here at the end of the presentation, but having the proper policies, procedures, and services in place to help reduce and shrink this time. And again, this kind of goes back to having an incident response plan and a team. maybe people on the call aren't lucky to have a large team, or maybe you're a team of one in the IT world, but leveraging a partner to help, put together an incident response plan. What if something does go wrong? If you do have to declare an incident, have you tested that? Do you have the proper plan and procedure in place? And with that, I'll turn it over to Eric. We're going to dive a little bit more into the insurance side of things and how, the data and the numbers that you just saw are really affecting cyber insurance and kind of where the industry is today.
Thanks, Anthony. I don't know what might have happened to my video, but I think it'll come on when it's ready. I wanted to start off here talking a little bit about risk management overall. And I have a representative example of the various areas of risk that we typically look at from an insurance agency perspective when we're starting to deal with a client. And so, for instance, what you see here in blue is the average risk prevalency across all of the domain spaces in the insurance marketplaces. So there's like 825 classes of commercial insurance business, and the average goes across all of those. And then so what you see here in that opposing color, the sort of burnt orange color, is just a representative example of law firms, right? And so what you would imagine with law firms is first of all, professional liability being a large component of their risk management program, right? In an area where their primary product is their professional expertise that they're sharing there, so they're service-based business, right? And then, so you'd imagine that in that particular industry, professional liability would be an area where coverage would focus on, and the majority of the expense for that particular risk would come from professional liability. But what's happening is particularly interesting is that cyber risk is becoming much more important in that particular area, especially as it relates to law firms. So I wanted to start high level and talk about risk management programs that go across the entirety of the organization, but then start to really focus in on cyber liability insurance specifically. So really, who needs cyber liability insurance? And the idea is that any business that deals with sensitive information should have cyber liability insurance. Many of the contracts that we're being asked to review now between vendors, we have a number of law firm clients that are starting to do more and more contract work with larger companies, and they're requiring that just like you may be required to carry general liability insurance as a contractor for going on certain job sites, and as well as workers' comp insurance, they're now requiring cyber liability insurance, especially if you compete within the knowledge working segment of the business. And cyber liability insurance is predominantly broken into a couple coverage parts, which we're going to get to here as first party and third party. But we're going to start really by thinking about the size of your entity, right? And for the longest time, businesses would often think, I'm really too small to be a target, right? Especially as they were thinking about their overall risk profile, and perhaps even that if it's a small contracting organization or a manufacturing organization or a service-based business with less than 50 employees, they may be thinking, we're not a target. Well, simply the losses have shown otherwise, that the softer targets are those SMBs, right? Because they're typically less prepared for attacks. They're more vulnerable. They don't have as much money in the budget to invest in their information security posture. And because of that, the cyber criminals look at them as easy paydays in many cases. Just, if I may, I'm going to have a quick poll. If you guys could just post in the chat whether or not you currently use positive pay. And if you don't know what positive pay is, that's okay. Just say no. If you do know what it is, please say yes. Again, that question is, do you use positive pay? Great. Good, so it's a mixed bag. Seeing about 50% saying yes and about 50% saying no. I'm going to go a little bit outside of our agenda just for a second to talk about positive pay because it's particularly important. If you're a business that has any cash whatsoever, which is all of us, right? Cash in the bank, we all at least have some element of it. The amount of check fraud that's going around right now is just unbelievable. And check fraud typically occurs where somebody gets a copy of your check with the routing and account number information and then generates a new fake check, right? And there are many ways that they can extract money from that particular transaction. They may send it to somebody, have them cash it, and then have them send back a crypto transaction or a money order or gift card, something like that. Or they may try to cash it themselves if they're particularly brazen. But so if somebody has a check that looks like it came from your entity, it has the correct account number, the correct routing number, and they put, for instance, $10,000 as the amount, their bank will voucher that check. That check will come back to your bank, and your bank will typically release the funds, unless you have given them instruction that you want them to follow positive pay. And positive pay is essentially a pre-authorization of a check that says that if I cut a check out of QuickBooks right now, tonight there'll be a file that goes from QuickBooks to my bank that says, Eric Wistran just cut a check for $5,000 to Sally's printing service, right? And it'll provide the bank the date of the check, the amount authorized amount of the check, as well as the check number. And what the bank does is they say, essentially, we won't clear any checks without them matching the pre-authorized check list. And what that helps to do is prevent check fraud. So I just mentioned this because we're seeing a ton of check fraud occurring every day amongst our clients, and the only ones that are truly at risk are the ones that don't have positive pay implemented right now. So if in your business you answered no to that question before, please work with your bank to implement positive pay. If you have any questions, give me a ring after this presentation. So just back on track with cyber liability insurance. As our team was talking about before, as Anthony was alluding to the costs of certain data breaches, when you think about what limits do I need for my cyber liability insurance, you're starting from a place of saying, well, what data do I have, right? If you have personally identifiable information for people, and that is basically the sort of the most basic information you could have, social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, phone numbers, etc. There's a certain, and there's free data breach calculators out there that can show you how to go about calculating this. But essentially, that comes in the range of like $40 to $50 a record. But then there's personal financial data that would be like credit card information or bank account routing information. And then there's PHI, so personal health information. And those two distinctly are much more expensive on a per record basis if there's a breach. But as we look at the coverages that are available through cyber insurance, there's some incident response planning. There's some, and we'll get to that in a little bit, right? So, like as we, and I'm actually just going to skip this slide one second, and come back to that. So there's two main aspects that I like to discuss in the way of the insurance marketplace, and so what you can see in this area, and I might be able to draw on this. Yeah, so as you can see, my little mark here and my little mark right here. Okay, so what you can see is underwriting requirements having been quite low for a period of time, and then popping up fairly significantly in this first mark. And really what that is the beginning of COVID-19. So essentially what had happened is the cyber underwriters previously had understood that there were elements of physical security that every business had. And the underwriters would rely on those physical security controls to be able to have some semblance of baseline security, right? Like we all wake up, we go into the office every day, so the firewall really has to be around this particular office building. And back in the day, the computers really never left there, so not everybody had laptops. They were mostly desktops. So the security model was quite simple. What happened, as we know through COVID, is that the physical security of the office building kind of no longer existed. Everybody took their laptops, they went home. It was really, really hard for the IT security apparatus to say with certainty, yeah, Suzanne is the only one touching that laptop every day, right? And that her child late at night isn't on that laptop, you know, hammering away and watching Netflix or doing some sort of YouTube surfing that's not necessarily authorized, right? So the entire paradigm of information security started to shift very rapidly through COVID. And insurance underwriters started to clamp down on underwriting requirements. That's why you see that red line there advancing very, very quickly across the y-axis. And primarily that is coming from multi-factor authentication. So what the underwriters really viewed as, instead of a nice-to-have option, something that would be critically important to writing a risk. And shortly after that, you're seeing accounts, meaning customers, having their cyber liability insurance policies non-renewed if they didn't comply with those new layers of security, such as multi-factor authentication. So as you can see, attacks just steadily increasing over time. You can see claims affecting the insurance marketplace and continuing to develop premiums, right? That's why you're starting to see this rising. But the particularly interesting thing is underwriting requirements starting to set the prices and the appetites for those insurance carriers. And what has happened essentially is a particularly interesting crossroads. So we have the maturity of cybersecurity controls, right? So imagine this is a particular like two-person law office, right? That's not particularly sophisticated in terms of their current information security background right now and their layers of controls. So for instance, I'm not calling out law offices here in particular, other than saying that I have a lot of experience with them. You can imagine a law office that uses their own private Gmail addresses to converse with clients. They don't have multi-factor authentication on those Gmail accounts, and they happen to use the same password to log into their Gmail account that they use to log into the American Bar Association, that, by the way, just got hacked earlier in 2023. So they are soft targets, and because they don't have those layers of controls, the carriers have set rates for them that are quite high per $1 million in revenue that business has, right? And so what happens as you move along cyber security maturity and implementing additional controls, which we'll talk about later, your premium rate per $1 million in revenue goes down. I'm just going to pause for questions. If anyone has questions, please feel free. All right, cool. So we're going to talk for a second about loss control recommendations. Typically what we find from a cyber liability insurance perspective is the application that is filled out every year is a representation. It's like a warranty that you're giving to the insurance company saying that, yes, here are all my practices, here are my controls, and you're essentially saying to the insurance company that at the time of a breach, if there is a claim, that these are the controls you have in place and make a best effort to follow up on a regular basis and make sure are actually in place. And so when it's really important when filling out that application that you do a bit of a deep dive into the business to make sure that what you're filling out is accurate, right? I'm going to use the example of a bank, a particular regional bank that has a CFO and finance division, and then separately an IT and security division. And the CFO of the bank gets the cyber liability insurance application, fills it out to the best of his ability, and then for a couple of questions, phones over to the IT director and asks for a specific yes or no on a particular question. For instance, do privileged user accounts have multi-factor authentication? And the IT person says, well, yes, but it's complicated. And then the CFO just simply puts down yes as the answer to the question. There's a distinct gap in what the application typically says in terms of the answers that are filled out and what reality is. And so we find it's particularly important that when you're reviewing that cyber liability application and going through the process of renewal, it's really, or even on the new business side, it's particularly important to sit down and go through each of those questions with your insurance agent, with your IT folks, and your finance apparatus, so that everybody's on the same page with how those answers to those questions are put down in the record. Because you don't want to be in a situation where at the time of a claim you've said, no, we absolutely don't have any obsolete systems, and as it turns out, you do, right? So a couple loss control recommendations. These are representative examples. These are what we typically see in working with new and existing clients is we're recommending implementation of multi-factor authentication for email access and VPN access. We're asking and then helping to test for secure backups to make sure that the client is able to restore within in a given amount of time that they agree is reasonable. We're doing a lot of email security training for staff and testing in terms of actual phishing testing. We're reviewing access audits as well as who has domain admin credentials or local admin rights on given users. I see we have a question here from John. Do carriers also require vulnerability scans and intrusion testing? Would those practices reduce premiums? So the direct answer is it depends. Some carriers are much more sophisticated than others. There's a gradient, and we'll talk about the differences between certain carriers a little bit later on in the discussion. Some carriers, for instance, Coalition has a real-time and regular process of doing sort of surface level vulnerability scans. And they built that into their model for pricing. So from their perspective, it is priced in that all of the clients that are going to be in their book of business are going to undergo regular vulnerability scans. I haven't seen a carrier that is doing themselves intrusion testing, which I would rate as a higher level, like a penetration testing type scenario. I've seen requirements, however, for larger entities that they have regular penetration testing or vulnerability testing done, especially if they have proprietary applications. So if you were thinking about, if you are a bank, again, in this example, and you have a proprietary system for business banking that you've built from the ground up and maintained, the insurance carrier may want to see regular intrusion detection. They'll certainly want to see intrusion detection and response, but they may want to see penetration testing done on that custom application, and that will certainly be included in their pricing and their underwriting model. So whereas a couple of years ago, pre-COVID, it wasn't particularly important that these cyber underwriters continue a process of more real-time underwriting, it's becoming very, very important because of the rise in cyber attacks. And hopefully that answers your question, John. Happy to dig into that more. As we continue thinking about loss control recommendations, typically seeing things in the way of software restricted policies or application whitelisting. In my opinion, besides multi-factor authentication, this is going to be your most important area of time spent, because now you're basically saying, I'm only allowing specific applications to run on our work computers within our network, and saying everything else can't run. It's difficult to manage, but it is the single, in my mind, behind multi-factor authentication, it's the single biggest preventative measure that can be used to frankly, aid your boots on the ground employees and staff against getting a malware infection that they happen to click on the wrong link or something like that, right? And then typically you'd see mobile device management, full disk encryption, things of that nature, endpoint detection and response, and then really making sure that systems are patched. So known vulnerabilities are patched, special patches that are released by the manufacturer are applied within a certain period of time. And some use of data loss prevention, right? So I can keep going with a couple claim examples. We talked about some of this stuff earlier. I'll just go through these kind of quickly. Social engineering, and we bring up this one specifically because coverage wording is very, very different across different cyber liability insurance policies. So I encourage each of you that are on this call that have a cyber liability insurance policy now to pull it out when you find time and review some of the particulars on the declarations page of that policy, because what you should be looking for is something called social engineering coverage or funds transfer coverage. There's a number of them that we work through a model to look for and explain. But essentially, if there are, let's say, 20 different insurers that are out there writing cyber liability insurance, there's really no common language yet for them. They have some of the major coverages nailed down, but in cases of specific, like social engineering specific sublimits, they may refer to them all quite differently, and their definitions are important as well as their exclusions. So a social engineering claim example is typically, someone posing as the CFO via email on the outside requests W-2s of all employees so they could process returns. The controller of the organization forwarded W-2s to the imposter, so someone on the outside impersonating the CFO. And then that person on the outside filed false tax returns on behalf of the employees and essentially incurred a very significant amount of claims related to it. The sublimit in this particular case, and in many particular cases with cyber liability policies, is going to be $250,000 and subject to a deductible. The importance of working with an insurance agent here is to encourage them to negotiate these sublimits on your behalf. And if you lean on it, it will happen. So I just encourage you to look at that in more depth. We're all familiar with ransomware. especially when it's initiated just via an inbound email. Imagine there's an email that comes in where a staff member isn't as diligent or isn't as default suspect as they typically are, and they click on a link and it encrypts every file on their computer, on the shared drive, on the manufacturing system that runs the warehouse, all of that stuff, and there results in significant losses due to that cause. The ransomware sublimit is of particular importance, and especially the business interruption that causes. Let's say because there was a large national garage door manufacturer that was hit with a ransomware attack that was out of business for 6 weeks, and had to have their cyber liability policy enacted and step in to provide business interruption coverage that would cover their lost profit during that time. Lost data. If you have traveling employees, if you have employees that often end up leaving their briefcases in cars and their cars are stolen, having a good inventory of the data that they have access to and the data on those devices and making sure they're encrypted, all very important. But in the case of then notifying when you don't know what was lost and you have to kind of assume that everything that person had access to was lost, in this case, notification cost of settlement totaled $350,000, and this is for a particularly small firm, right? I'm giving these examples that are on very, very small firms in general, all right? The troubled employees are a bit of a sticky situation because you have to look at your cyber insurance policy and with specific attention on the exclusions. There's provisions in certain policies that address whether the actions of a rogue employee are covered. So it's important to look over the exclusions that are resident within your cyber insurance policy. In this particular case, the troubled employee stole personal account details of the business for the clients of that business and then ultimately published them online. So lots of defense cost issues, lots of settlement issues, lots of reputation costs issues. So as I mentioned before, the insurance industry has not developed standard policy language. Some are beginning to adopt it. Some are just kind of falling in line and referring to network security and privacy liability as a sub-coverage, referring to business interruption. That's pretty standard. Referring to media liability or errors and omissions as a standard coverage, but the sublimits still remain kind of the Wild West. Just an example of some of the work that we try to do on the control side, and this is where we end up working very closely with Xamin. In the instance of this particular example that I'm very familiar with is a privately held company based in New Jersey, considerably large, about 1,000 employees, $1 billion in revenues. We did a network diagnostic and a security assessment to essentially review what their cyber liability application was stating they had in terms of controls versus what they actually had. And we'll note for the lawyers that are on this call, it is particularly important to protect that review under the attorney-client privilege. So for any business that is having a network diagnostic or security assessment or an assessment done through their insurance agency should look to protect that under attorney-client privilege. Again, I am not an attorney, so it's not legal advice. It's just something to consider. We were able to determine in this particular case that the customer had some very out-of-date systems that hadn't been patched in a particularly long amount of time. was not running multi-factor authentication. And one of the aspects of this is that their cyber liability insurance cost had skyrocketed in recent years before we became involved. And we were able to help them prioritize what controls to implement in order to get that cyber liability cost under control from a insurance premiums perspective. And the results were something that we're quite proud of. We were able to reduce that by about 75% and negotiate for better coverage limits and broader wording in a number of those cases. The security can no longer be something that just the IT folks are responsible for. It has to be part of the fabric of the business. It has to be part of the credo and the mission statement to say that we're here to protect our customers' information. We're here to make sure that we have continuity in the case where, ultimately we all know at some point we're going to get breached. Even if we have layers and layers and layers of protection, it could happen. We also have to be prepared for how we're going to navigate those types of things, and that's where cyber liability insurance comes in. And so I've said a lot. I'm going to pause for a second, but I'm going to end on this one this one thought, this one idea. There's an intersection between cyber liability controls. Cyber liability insurance premiums and cyber liability and cybersecurity controls from a network security perspective. And I encourage you to work with your contacts at your IT security firms as well as your insurance agents to make sure that you guys are all talking the same language. And I'm going to, I think, transition it over to Jeremy now, right, Jeremy?
Oh, glad I said that I wasn't the only one. Jeremy, if you can hear us, we are seeing the slides, but we're not able to hear what you're saying. If you want to, we'll back up here a minute. Maybe rejoin the audio. Nope. Looks like he left it. He's going to hop right back in. Jeremy, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, loud and clear now. You're good to go.
All right. Fun with webinar platforms. Sorry about that, guys. So you didn't hear anything I said. It sounds like
we saw the first couple slides, but I backed it up. So why don't you kick us off from the beginning?
Okay, cool. So I was really just saying I don't have a whole lot of slides. I'm going to finish this up and wrap this up pretty quick for you guys. I just wanted to highlight a few couple of next steps as it relates to what Eric was sharing with us. So again, Eric had shared this before. I just wanted to share it again and just really identify that on that green line. That's our goal here at Xamin, is to push everybody to the right as far as maturity of cyber controls, which ultimately, again, as Eric mentioned, reduces the insurance premium. So most organizations we start working with are somewhere in the middle, and our goal is to get you as far right as possible, which again ultimately saves the organization money. So the first step in reviewing your cyber assessment, you're determining your current posture, is doing some sort of assessment. But this assessment should not only focus on the technical components, as a lot of people seem to default to when we talk about cyber insurance, cybersecurity, and IT, but policies and the procedures that govern the production environment. So the control review process should include reviewing physical, technical, and administrative controls. So the physical controls, like Eric mentioned, are some of the more legacy concepts, things like the physical location, digital access key cards, security cameras. Technical controls, it obviously involves a whole litany of different items, from configuration of devices, logical separation of networks, redundancies within your environment. And then the administrative controls piece, which is a really important part, but we really find is really lacking in a lot of organizations, is the policies, procedures, third-party vendor contracts, and dealing with those third parties. So part of the assessment in the annual review process should be assessing third-party risk. As we know, supply chain issues and how those affect your third party can certainly affect your organization, especially SMBs, who typically will outsource a lot of different IT services, and even enterprise, specifically security services. Typically something's outsourced, and it's usually a pretty critical part of your security or your IT operation. So understanding your third-party risk is very important, and that usually starts with the vendor management program. So that's going to be a policy that's going to govern the program, doing vendor risk assessments to understand the risk that you're in and the current security posture of those vendors, and then some sort of solution, whether that's software or SaaS apps, to monitor and track third-party vendor status. After reviewing these controls, obviously weaknesses and gaps in the cybersecurity program are identified, and then a remediation plan will be created through the report process to close those gaps and strengthen the overall security. And again, as Eric mentioned, and as we all know, cyber insurance premiums and those cyber insurance contracts are typically an annual renewal. And because of that, it's your cybersecurity program, and the ever-changing landscape should be evolving with that. So doing an IT assessment on an annual basis at minimum will ensure that you're providing that proactive monitoring and ultimately reducing the risk. So there's a lot of different aspects to the IT risk assessment process and things that will help your organization be positioned better for cyber insurance. But one of the specific areas as it relates to cybersecurity coverage is the importance of business continuity. So business continuity and disaster recovery strategies are critical to the overall cybersecurity program and just the operation of the business. It'll provide confidence in your data protection and backup system through regular testing and validation of those backup images. And it also creates a defined and documented plan to detect, respond, and recover from a security incident. So many times the incident response plan is also going to be wrapped up into the business continuity. And together, those things provide, a pretty good foundation for disaster recovery. Specifically talking about cyber insurance, having a strong data backup and protection system helps lower premiums by proving that the organization can recover successfully using its current backup solution. Testing usually occurs in two frequencies. That's regular testing, either weekly or monthly, just to validate you could pull a file and restore from an image. And then a more comprehensive, holistic disaster recovery test, usually on an annual basis, which will validate the actual restoration of your entire IT operations. Another item is encrypting data backup at rest and in flight, again, helping to prevent against ransomware attacks. And then having defined recovery time objectives and recovery point objectives, or RTOs, RPOs, and validating they can be met. So, in a BC or a business continuity disaster recovery policy, Defining RTOs and RPOs provides a time frame for expected restore. And then through the annual testing process, you can validate those time frames and adjust as needed. So again, these areas should be evaluated as part of the risk assessment process. But this is just another area of IT as it relates to cyber insurance that's really important to kind of do a deep dive, again, on an annual basis at minimum. So just kind of wrap up this kind of section here. So we just touched on the assessment area here in this cyber resilience graphic. Here at Xamin, we really believe by strengthening these areas, you become a cyber resilient organization, which provides the most comprehensive cybersecurity program. Again, we focused on the assessment area and touched on some of the proactive measures. But to summarize the methodology, we break it down into these 5 categories. So assessing, again, by understanding how a cyber attack can impact your organization, you can better develop proactive and systematic processes like business continuity and recovery plans. To mitigate, create, or hire cross-functional teams, to plan for threats or attacks and implement strong cybersecurity measures. Observe, so again, this is going to be monitoring with either machine detection and industry experts on your team. It's more real time, again, proactive observations of security and the overall information security program. Responding, so when the threat's there, you can rapidly restore and function with a proper incident response plan to avoid interruption. And finally, adapt. So again, threats continue to develop. Cyber insurance continues to get more educated on the threats that affect a real world and a security organization. So making continuous improvements to the plan and to support your organization and continue to thrive in adverse conditions. So again, the most important information I think we got out of here today was the things Eric was sharing. But the goal to get to that and to be able to lower those and have the confidence to answer those questions right is to really understand where your organization is currently at and how to mitigate those risks a little bit further.
Excellent. Thanks, Jeremy. We'll pause here for any questions. If you do have them, feel free to type them in the chat, and we'll get to those. We will also share our contact information here with the presentation, so if there's anything that comes to mind after, you'll have that as well. A few more seconds here. Any questions? All right. Well, great. Well, with that, again, we appreciate the time and everyone taking a little bit out of the day to attend here today. Hopefully, it was insightful for you and got you thinking a little bit more about the current policies that you may have and questions and how you can get better. Again, if there are questions around evaluating the current environment, where you are from a cybersecurity maturity perspective or controls perspective, here at Xamin, we have the team and resources and projects to help you with that. If there are any questions around insurance, as Eric mentioned, some of the materials that he went through, by all means, he is ready and willing to have those conversations and provide any documentation there. So we appreciate the time, everyone. Thanks for joining. And as I mentioned before, we will send out a copy of this presentation. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks everyone for joining.